So what is Amazon Cognito? So in the previous videos, we have seen how our Lambda function interacts with different AWS services, but it is not still clear on how to manage authentication for external users interacting with AWS resources and Lambda functions from a client application. So if you look at the slides, Amazon Cognito has been designed specifically to make it simple for external users and applications to assume a role on AWS and get temporary security credentials. Amazon Cognito makes it easy to follow AWS security best practices, such as not hard coding AWS credentials whenever possible, especially when you can't control access to those credentials, such as a JavaScript code downloaded from a browser or a web or a mobile application. So Amazon Cognito can be used to provide AWS credentials to the client so that the client application could directly invoke AWS Lambda functions. And we will see an example of that in this section. And you can use the same approach to protect the web APIs exposed by Amazon API Gateway as well. Now, Cognito provides more than AWS credentials. Now, based on the external authentication, Cognito gives a unique identity or unique identity ID that follows users across any device they use. And for unauthenticated users, Cognito gives a guest identity ID that will stick with the device they are using. Could be a smartphone or a tablet or a browser. So in this way, Cognito supports two kinds of identities: unauthenticated and authenticated, and each will have a different IAM role associated with them, and that IAM role will be assumed using the returned credentials. Usually you would give less powerful permissions to the unauthenticated role. For example, unauthenticated users can only read from the AWS resources used by the app or your browser, while authenticated users will have a more powerful role that allows them to write on those resources. For example, you could give authenticated users write access to AWS resources used by an application directly via AWS Lambda functions, so they can upload files or change data on the database. The only information required by the client application is still the identity pool ID. No AWS credentials are embedded in the applications or transferred over a non-secure channel. And we are going to look at this in our next example. And the authentication with the identity provider is managed by the tools and the SDK maintained by the provider. So basically there are two possible patterns. One will have authenticated users and the other could have both unauthenticated and authenticated users. And depending on how you use your AWS service within your application, you can interact with the application in different ways.